Hello and welcome to the channel. This is Literature Simplified, where I explain English literature in simple English. Today we are going to be talking about the thematic concerns or themes in the play All My Sons by Arthur Miller. For BA in English Literature students of IGNOU, this is subject code BEGC-105, Block 1, Unit 3. Now let's begin. The objectives of this unit are that we will study the different themes present in the play All My Sons. The unit focuses on themes such as social responsibility, marriage, idealism, the relationship between father and son, the relationship between mother and son, and the idea that actions always have consequences. Now we come to the introduction. In All My Sons, we find many themes working together. Among all these themes, the theme of social responsibility is the most important and central theme of the play. Along with this major theme, there are several other themes. These themes may seem minor when compared to social responsibility, but they are so closely connected with the main theme that they become an essential part of the play. They are woven into the main theme and cannot be separated from it. The play All My Sons has one major theme, and that is the theme of social responsibility. This theme highlights the importance of a man's duty towards society and his country and shows that this duty should come before his responsibility towards his own family. The play clearly shows the tragic results of a man's mistake when he tries to become rich and give his family a comfortable and luxurious life by ignoring his responsibility towards society. Joe Keller wants to achieve the American dream. This dream goes back to the early Puritan settlers who came to America with the idea of building a new Jerusalem. In practical terms, this meant creating a strong economic civilization in the new land. Over time, however, the meaning of success changed. Success began to be achieved through manipulation and by ignoring moral values. Joe Keller believes only in this economic version of the American dream where money and success matter more than values and morality. Joe Keller's dream is limited only to his family. His main aim is to look after the comfort and security of his family. Because of this obsession, he cheats his own friend and business partner, Steve Deaver. He is guided by a narrow and short sighted idea of the American dream, where success is achieved through dishonesty and manipulation. He believes that in a competitive world, one must succeed alone, even if it means harming others. His fear of failure leads him not only to betray his friend, but also to betray his own country. Joe Keller owns a factory that manufactures aircraft engine parts. During the war, his factory receives an urgent order from the army to supply cylinder heads for aircraft. Unfortunately, the entire batch of cylinder heads produced by the factory develops cracks in them. On the day the urgent order arrives, Joe Keller is at home while Steve Deaver is present at the factory. Steve Deaver calls Joe Keller to inform him about the hairline cracks found in the cylinder heads. At this point, Joe Keller could have asked Steve Deaver to stop the supply of the defective parts. However, he fears that stopping the supply would cause heavy financial loss. The factory had produced 120 defective cylinder heads. Throwing them away and making new ones would cause a delay and might lead to the cancellation of the army contract. Moreover, the army needed the parts urgently because the war was still going on. Because of financial pressure and his desire to protect his business, Keller decided to take a risk. He cannot bear the thought of his business collapsing, especially after spending 40 years building that business. Thinking only about his personal and family interests, he calls Steve Deaver and asks him to weld the cracks and ship the defective cylinder heads to the army. Keller tells him that he is suffering from the flu and he cannot come to the factory, but he assures him that he will take full responsibility for the decision. Later, while defending his action, Keller tells his son that he believed the army authorities would test the cylinder heads themselves and inform him if anything was wrong. However, this does not happen. As a result, 21 aircraft crash and 21 pilots lose their lives. Both Joe Keller and Steve Deaver knew that supplying defective cylinder heads could endanger the lives of the pilots. Still, they chose profit over responsibility and do not think about the consequences of their actions. Keller completely ignores his social responsibility and he puts his material interests above human life. For Joe Keller, responsibility towards his family is more important than responsibility towards society. This wrong choice leads to disastrous consequences. Keller believes that his actions reflect the values of American capitalist society, which measures success in terms of money and economic gain. He openly states that everyone worked for money during the war and that war and peace are also matters of profit and loss. By doing so, Joe Keller places his loyalty to his family above his duty to society as a whole. The play shows that this selfish attitude leads to tragedy and destruction. Now we look at the problem of Chris's marriage as a theme. One of the minor themes of the play All My Sons is the problem of Chris's marriage. Kate Keller, Joe's wife, believes that her son Larry, who went to the war as a fighter pilot, will one day return home even though the war ended 3 years ago. Larry had been reported missing during the war, and for all practical purposes, he was presumed to be dead. Before Larry went to the war, he was in love with Ann Deaver, the daughter of Steve Deaver, and they were engaged to be married. After Larry was reported missing, Anne accepted the fact that Larry was no longer alive. Chris, Larry's brother, falls in love with Anne after Larry is presumed dead. Chris wishes to marry Anne and keeps in touch with her by writing letters. Later, he invites her to his house so that he can formally propose to her. Anne comes to the Keller household in response to Chris's invitation and agrees to marry him. However, the peaceful and seemingly happy situation of the Keller family is disturbed by Anne's arrival. Her coming to the Keller household raises many questions that had remained unanswered for 3 years. These questions eventually lead to Joe Keller's downfall and the collapse of the Keller family. Anne's arrival connects the present with the past and shows how past actions lead to present consequences. Although everyone else in the Keller household believes that Larry is dead, Kate continues to believe that Larry is alive and he will return one day. Joe Keller is aware of Chris's plan to invite Anne home, but he tells Chris that his mother will never agree to the marriage. This is because Kate believes Larry is alive and considers Anne to be Larry's fiancée. Kate is already suspicious of Anne's visit to the Keller house. When she learns that Chris intends to marry Anne, she strongly disapproves of the marriage. For Kate, agreeing to this marriage would mean accepting that Larry is dead. Accepting Larry's death would also mean admitting that Joe Keller is guilty of the crime that led to the death of 21 pilots. Anne, however, is willing to marry Chris because she is convinced that Larry is dead. The apple tree planted in Larry's memory, which falls due to a strong wind on the day of Anne's arrival, strengthens Anne's belief that this event has a deeper meaning. Kate, however, refuses to accept both Chris's and Anne's firm belief that Larry is dead. The situation becomes even more complicated with the arrival of George Deaver, who is Anne's brother. George comes to the Keller household to stop Anne's marriage to Chris. He does this after meeting his father, Steve Deaver, in prison in Columbus and learning certain truths about the case in which his father was convicted while Joe Keller was declared innocent. After arriving at the Keller house, George confronts Joe Keller and tries to expose his involvement in the crime. He tells Anne that he will not allow her to marry Chris, the son of the man who destroyed their father's life. Kate wants Anne to leave the house with George because she still believes that Larry is alive and thinks that Anne should wait for his return. Chris clearly states that Anne will not leave and that he intends to marry her because Larry is dead. Kate argues that Larry is alive and says that if everyone believes Larry is dead, then it would mean that his father killed him. She insists that a father can never kill his own son and therefore Larry must be alive. Even though Kate knows deep down that Larry is dead, she continues to live in self deception and clings to her belief that Larry will return someday. To justify this belief, she adopts a blind faith in religion and firmly argues that God would never allow a son to be killed by his father. To defend himself, Joe Keller says that Larry could not have died because of engine failure since he was not flying a P 40 aircraft. This statement makes Chris suspicious about his father's role in supplying defective cylinder heads, and he asks Keller directly whether he was responsible for the death of the other pilots. Joe Keller tries to hide the truth from Chris, but when Chris threatens him, Keller finally admits his guilt. He confesses that if the defective cylinder heads had not been supplied to the army, he would have become bankrupt. To save his factory from ruin, he felt he had no other option but to ship the faulty parts. Keller admits that he was aware of the possible consequences but believed that the army would check the parts before using them and inform him if there were any problems. Chris is shocked and furious at his father's attempt to justify his actions. He accuses Keller of endangering the lives of 21 pilots. Feeling helpless and disgusted by his father's crime, Chris decides to leave home and earn his living independently. He refuses to live on the money earned through his father's dishonest actions. Anne offers to go with Chris, but he refuses to take her along. Kate has made Chris feel deeply guilty about marrying Anne. Kate objects to the marriage, saying that Chris must wait for Larry to return. She warns that if Chris marries Anne, he will always remain unhappy and burdened by guilt because Anne belongs to Larry. Anne firmly states that Larry died when his plane crashed off the coast of China on the 25th of November and that the crash was not caused by engine failure. Kate refuses to believe this and accuses Anne of lying. In order to save her relationship with Chris, Anne finally shows Kate a letter written by Larry on the last day of his life. This letter serves as proof of Larry's death. Kate is not shocked by the letter because she already knew the truth. Chris also had a vague awareness of his father's guilt. Kate could not accept Larry's death because doing so would prove that her husband was guilty. Chris, on the other hand, could not accept his father's guilt because he had always admired and respected him. In the letter, Larry tells Anne that he learned from the newspaper about his father's involvement in supplying defective cylinder heads that caused the death of so many pilots. Ashamed of his father's crime, Larry chose to end his life by deliberately crashing his plane. Anne had also been living in denial after receiving this letter. She knew about Joe Keller's guilt but kept silent for 3 years, revealing the truth only when she is forced to do so in order to save her relationship with Chris. Another theme that exists alongside the main theme in the play All My Sons is the theme of idealism. Chris Keller has an idealistic way of thinking and looking at life. He feels guilty even about wanting to marry Anne and settle down into a happy, comfortable life because all the soldiers who were under his command during the war have been killed. These soldiers, according to Chris, repeatedly proved through their actions that they were true human beings. Chris feels deep guilt for having survived the war while the other soldiers lost their lives. To console himself, he tries to believe that the soldiers who died were sacrificing their lives for a noble cause. In his view, by giving up their lives, these soldiers were contributing to the creation of a better world. However, when the war ends and Chris returns home, he is shocked to discover that nothing has changed in society. He finds the same selfishness, the same competition to make money, and the same desire to achieve the American dream that existed before the war. This realization makes Chris feel that the soldiers had died in vain, as their sacrifices did not lead to any positive change in the world. Chris begins to feel ashamed of everything around him. He feels ashamed while looking at his checkbook, while driving his new car, and even while seeing the new refrigerator that has been bought for the house. He feels uncomfortable enjoying these material comforts and becomes hesitant about marrying Anne because he feels that he has no moral right to live a happy life when others have died. During the war, Chris had seen strong bonding and a sense of unity among the soldiers. In contrast, in civilian life, he sees people driven only by selfish motives and personal gain. This contrast strengthens his idealistic dissatisfaction with society. Chris's idealistic nature also has a strong influence on Dr. Jim Bayliss. Jim becomes so inspired by Chris's ideas that he wants to give up his regular medical practice and to take up medical research. However, this decision upsets his wife Sue, who accuses Chris of misleading her husband and filling his mind with unrealistic ideas. Although medical research had given Jim great satisfaction and made that period of his life happier, he eventually gives it up to please Sue, for whom material comfort and financial security are more important. Chris openly says that business does not inspire him. It goes against his principles to join his father's business, which he believes has been built on dishonest and fraudulent practices. He's afraid that if he joins the business, he too may follow society's corrupt definition of success. Chris's idealism finally forces his father, Joe Keller, to confront the seriousness of his crime. Through Chris's moral pressure and idealistic values, Joe Keller is made to realize his responsibility towards society and the magnitude of his guilt in causing the death of 21 pilots. As a result of this realization, Joe Keller chooses to punish himself by committing suicide for his crime. Another theme that is closely connected with the main theme in the play All My Sons is the theme of the father son relationship. Joe Keller strongly believes that the bond between a father and his son is the most important relationship in the world. He openly declares that there is nothing his son could do that he would not forgive simply because he is his son and Keller is his father. According to Keller, there is nothing greater than this relationship, and if there is anything bigger than the bond between father and son, he says he would rather kill himself. Chris Keller has a very high opinion of his father. He looks up to him as an ideal and flawless father figure. Chris is emotionally very close to his father and has complete trust in him. Joe Keller is the first person to whom Chris reveals his plan to marry Anne. Chris seeks his father's support in dealing with his mother Kate, who still considers Anne to be Larry's fiancée. Joe Keller doesn't want to interfere directly in this complicated matter. He feels that Chris's marriage is a personal decision and also fears that his wife Kate will strongly oppose the idea of Chris's marrying Larry's former fiancée, Anne. Keller behaves more like a friend than a strict father towards Chris. He gives him friendly advice and suggests that Chris should first confirm Anne's feelings before planning the marriage. Chris tells his father that from the letters he has received from Anne, he believes that she has completely forgotten Larry. Chris expects his father to support him if Kate refuses to give her consent. He even threatens to leave the house and live elsewhere if he is not allowed to marry Anne. This shocks Keller deeply. He becomes worried not only about losing his son but also about the family business that he has built, especially for Chris. Chris then emotionally pressures his father by saying that he will stay back and take responsibility for the family business only if he is allowed to marry Anne. This shows how deeply personal and emotional the father son relationship is in the play. Chris completely refuses to believe that his father could be guilty when Anne tells him that Sue has mentioned that the neighbors believe Joe Keller manipulated the case involving the defective cylinder heads. Defending his father, Chris says that he would never have forgiven him if he had truly been guilty of fraud. Chris firmly believes that his father is innocent and that he has been falsely accused. The arrival of Anne's brother George creates serious conflict between Chris and Keller. George reveals that Joe Keller is actually the main culprit in the defective cylinder head case and that he deceived Steve Deaver. Chris strongly objects to these accusations and refuses to believe that his father could cheat his business partner. George argues that the court failed to see Keller's clever manipulation, but Chris insists that he knows his father well and that Keller is incapable of such a crime. Chris again strongly denies George's accusations. When George asks permission to question Keller directly, Chris confidently says that his father has done nothing wrong and that he already knows what answers Keller will give. However, under pressure from George, Chris finally breaks the appearance of family harmony that had been maintained for so long and directly questions his father about his involvement in the dishonest business transaction. In response, Keller justifies himself by saying that financial pressure and his responsibility towards his family forced him to supply the defective cylinder heads. At this point, the relationship between father and son begins to collapse because of the clash between their moral principles. Joe Keller firmly believes that nothing in the world is more important than one's family and that the bond between father and son is supreme. He tries to justify his actions by telling Chris that he committed the crime only for his sake. He explains that at the age of 61, he had no opportunity left to rebuild his life or business and that he took the risk only to secure Chris's future. Chris, however, has a completely different set of values. He believes that there is a world beyond one's family and that human beings have responsibility towards society as a whole. In Chris's view, all the pilots who were killed because of the defective cylinder heads were also Joe Keller's sons. Keller continues to defend himself by saying that he supplied the faulty parts to avoid bankruptcy. He explains that his business had taken 40 years to build and that at his age he could not start again if it collapsed. He claims that everything he did was for Chris's future and the survival of the family. He also argues that there was nothing wrong in making money and that everyone else had earned money by questionable means during the war. Chris's character stands in complete contrast to his father's character. The conflict between them arises because Chris is deeply conscious of social responsibility, while Keller blindly follows a distorted view of the American dream. Chris feels ashamed of his father's values and says that he had always admired his father, but now Keller has fallen in his eyes. Chris admits that he had judged his father not as an ordinary man but as his father, which made it difficult for him to accept the truth. He becomes furious when Keller says that he endangered the lives of pilots for his family's sake. Chris reminds him that he himself risked his life every day during the war and watched soldiers under his command die, while Keller selfishly ignored the interests of the nation. Chris angrily accuses his father, asking him whether he has no sense of responsibility towards his country. He declares that Keller is worse than an animal because even animals do not kill their own. Chris is unable to decide how to punish his father and feels completely helpless and miserable. Larry's letter finally makes Joe Keller realize that there is something greater than just one's immediate family. In the letter, Larry explains that he could not live with the shame of knowing that his father was responsible for the death of innocent pilots. Keller understands that although Larry was his son, Larry believed that the pilots were also his father's sons. Realizing this truth, Keller accepts that he was wrong and punishes himself by committing suicide. Chris feels responsible for his father's self destruction. Keller had earlier wanted to rename his business from J.O. Keller Incorporated to J.O. Keller and Son, but Chris feels uncomfortable with this idea. Keller suspects that Chris is ashamed of the money earned through the business and tries to convince him that it was earned honestly. In contrast to the relationship between Chris and Joe Keller, George Deaver's relationship with his father changes during the course of the play. Initially, George rejects his father Steve Deaver, believing him to be the main criminal in the defective cylinder head case. Being an idealist like Chris, George cannot tolerate his father's involvement in a crime that killed 21 pilots for personal profit. However, after meeting his father in prison and hearing his side of the story, George's attitude changes. He becomes convinced that Joe Keller was actually responsible for the crime and not his father. George then comes to the Keller household to expose Keller's guilt and to stop Anne's marriage to Chris. Although George fails to convince the Keller family and Anne, his sincere efforts as a dutiful son disturb the apparent peace of the Keller household and contribute to the eventual collapse of the family. Another theme that is closely connected with the main theme of the play All My Sons is the theme of actions and their consequences. Joe Keller, who owns a factory manufacturing aircraft cylinder heads, is charged with supplying defective equipment to the army, which leads to the death of 21 pilots. Although it was Joe Keller's decision to ship the faulty cylinder heads, he denies responsibility for this act during the trial. As a result, the blame falls entirely on his business partner, Steve Deaver. Steve Deaver is convicted and sent to jail while Joe Keller is acquitted. After being declared innocent, Keller is able to restart his business successfully and regain the respect of his neighbors. Even though some people suspect that he may be guilty, they appear to accept him back into their social circle. However, the relief that Keller feels after his acquittal lasts only for 3 years. When the play begins, Anne Deaver, the daughter of Steve Deaver, comes to the Keller house to marry Chris Keller. Kate Keller strongly opposes the marriage between Chris and Anne. For Kate, agreeing to the marriage would mean accepting that her son Larry is dead because Anne had been engaged to Larry. Accepting Larry's death would also mean accepting that Joe Keller is responsible for the crime that caused Larry's death. Joe Keller becomes anxious and frightened when he learns that George Deaver, Anne's brother, and also a lawyer, is coming to the Keller house after visiting his father, Steve Deaver, in jail. George's arrival further complicates the situation because he comes with the intention of discovering the truth about the defective cylinder head case directly from Joe Keller. After meeting his father in prison, George becomes convinced that Joe Keller is equally responsible for the deaths of the pilots. He wants Anne to break off her engagement with Chris and return with him to New York. Although George is unable to directly force the truth out of Joe Keller, Kate Keller accidentally reveals an important secret. She lets slip that Joe hasn't been laid up in 15 years, which indirectly proves that Keller was not sick with the flu on the day the defective parts were shipped. In an attempt to protect her husband from being exposed as guilty, Kate once again insists that Larry is alive. She argues that if Larry were dead, it would mean that Joe Keller had killed him, and she firmly believes that God would never allow a father to kill his own son. Her denial is a way of avoiding the truth and its consequences. Chris angrily confronts his father, who tries to defend his actions by calling them a matter of business. Keller explains that a man works for 40 years to build a business and that one failed shipment can cancel contracts and destroy everything overnight. He says that he believed that the army would test the engine parts before using them and would send him a report, after which he would warn them. But by the time this could happen, the disaster had already occurred. Chris is shocked and horrified that his father knowingly risked the lives of the pilots. Keller, however, insists that he acted for Chris, for his family, and for the survival of his business. His actions reflect the profit oriented nature of capitalism. Wartime profiteering and placing business profit above human life were part of the American capitalist system, and Keller was one among many men who had made such choices based on their personal values. Keller believes that if he had not acted in this way, he would have lost his business and his family would have fallen into poverty. Chris, however, is deeply disgusted and ashamed of his father's decision, which ignored larger social and moral values in favor of personal gain. The consequences of Joe Keller's actions become fully clear when Anne reveals Larry's letter. She does so when she fears that her relationship with Chris is in danger. The letter shows that Larry intended to commit suicide because of his father's involvement in the deaths of the pilots. Larry could not live with the shame of his father's actions. Joe Keller is stunned by the consequences of his decisions. His actions not only caused the death of innocent pilots but also led his own son Larry to take his life. Finally, Keller realizes that in Larry's eyes and in a broader moral sense, the pilots who died were also his sons. Understanding the full weight of his guilt, Keller decides to punish himself. Joe Keller's suicide at the end of the play is a direct result of his realization that actions cannot be separated from their consequences. The deaths of the pilots and the death of his son are the unavoidable outcomes of his selfish decisions, and through this, the play strongly reinforces the theme that no action is without consequence. One of the minor themes that is again closely connected with the main theme of the play is the theme of the mother son relationship. In the relationship between Kate and Chris, Kate appears as a dominant figure. Although Chris is much closer to his father than to his mother, he still cares deeply for Kate and she is a loving and concerned mother towards him. Kate becomes suspicious when Anne visits the Keller household as she feels that Anne has come to marry Chris. Kate firmly believes that her son Larry is alive and will one day return and marry Anne. Both Anne and Chris try to make Kate understand that it is unreasonable to wait for a man who has been missing for 3 years. However, Kate refuses to accept this reality. Kate already knows that her husband Joe Keller is guilty of supplying defective cylinder heads, but she keeps this knowledge to herself. She lives in an illusion that Larry is alive and he'll return someday. Larry was very close to her heart, and because of this emotional attachment, she is unable to accept his death. Her irrational belief actually helps the family to remain united, and her false hope gives her the strength to carry on. Kate refuses to allow the marriage between Chris and Anne because giving her consent would mean accepting Larry's death. Accepting Larry's death would automatically lead to the exposure of her husband's crime of killing 21 pilots. Therefore, she continues to wait for Larry's return. Chris finds this belief absurd and feels that his mother is clinging to a false idea. According to him, Kate is the only woman in America who is still waiting for her son to return after being missing for 3 years. Since Kate knows about her husband's guilt, she is constantly worried. She asks Chris to protect both her and his father. She fears that Steve Deaver and George might reopen the case because during the last days of the trial, Steve Deaver had repeatedly claimed that George Keller forced him to ship the defective cylinder heads to the army. Both Chris and Kate are living in denial about Keller's guilt, but their denial takes different forms. As a result, they disagree on many issues. Chris does not accept Kate's belief that Anne secretly hates the Keller family because of her father. Kate insists that Anne is still waiting for Larry's return, while Chris strongly disagrees because he knows that Anne is in love with him. Kate does not want Anne to stay in the Keller household if her brother George leaves. She wants both Anne and George to leave together. Chris clearly tells Kate that Anne is not going anywhere. He also mocks Frank Luby for believing in astrology and being certain that Larry is still alive. Kate, however, trusts Frank's belief and disagrees with Chris. Both Chris and Kate know about the defective cylinder head case but deliberately avoid discussing it with each other so that the family can continue to live in apparent harmony. Chris becomes suspicious of his mother's knowledge of the truth when George accuses Kate of lying by saying that Keller had not been ill for the last 15 years. Later, Keller modifies Kate's statement by claiming that he had suffered from the flu. Kate explains that she had simply misspoken. Chris becomes furious when he learns that his mother has packed Anne's bag so that she can leave with George. Chris tells Kate clearly that Anne will not leave the house. He even threatens that if Anne has no place in the house, he himself will leave. Chris firmly declares that Larry is dead and that he intends to marry Anne. Kate still refuses to accept this decision and insists that everyone must wait for Larry's return. She indirectly suggests that Joe Keller is responsible for Larry's death by saying that if Larry were dead, it would mean that his father had killed him. She adds that a father never kills his son and therefore Larry must be alive. Taking a cue from this statement, Chris questions his father directly about the defective cylinder head case, forcing Keller to finally reveal the truth. Kate's concern for her son becomes clear when Chris disappears from the house after Keller admits his guilt. She becomes restless and advises Joe Keller to tell Chris that he is ready to go to prison to pay for his crime. She believes that this gesture will satisfy Chris and that he will forgive his father. However, Kate misjudges Chris's moral strength. After Chris refuses to speak to his father, Kate tries to act as a mediator between them. Joe asks Kate to tell Chris that he spoiled him by not making him work hard from a young age. He says that Chris should have been made to earn his living early so that he would have understood how difficult it is to make money. Joe also says that he does not need Chris's forgiveness because he committed the crime for the sake of his family. Kate explains that for Chris, the interests of the nation are more important than the interests of the family. She repeatedly tells Chris that Larry is alive, making him feel guilty about marrying Anne. She warns him that if he marries Larry's fiancée, he will never have a happy married life. Kate's continuous opposition finally forces Anne to show Larry's letter, which he wrote on the last day of his life. The letter's contents do not shock Kate because she already knows about her husband's guilt. Kate tries to prevent Chris from reading the letter, and Anne has to snatch it away from her to show it to him. Chris reads the letter and learns the truth about the circumstances in which Larry deliberately ended his life. After reading the letter, Joe Keller asks Chris to take him to the authorities so that he can surrender himself. Kate desperately pleads with Chris not to do so, saying that sending Keller to jail would be the same as killing him. Trying to save her husband, she conveniently argues that Larry's letter has no meaning now because the war is over. Chris then asks his mother whether Larry no longer matters to her. He makes both his parents realize that feeling sorry is not enough and that they must accept their responsibility towards society and towards the nation. Kate had repeatedly insisted that Larry was alive only to hide her husband's guilt. Once Larry's letter exposes the truth, she begins begging Chris not to take his father away, fearing that Keller will not survive in prison. After Joe Keller shoots himself inside the house, Kate consoles Chris like a caring mother. She tells him not to blame himself for her father's death. She asks him to be strong, to forget the past, and to move forward with his life. Here I've created a slide that gives you a comparison between Joe Keller and his son, Chris Keller, so that you can see the stark difference in their outlook and views upon morality and responsibility. So that was all for this video about the themes of All My Sons. I hope it was helpful to you. In case you liked it, please don't forget to like and also to subscribe to this channel where I will be explaining more literary works in simple English. And I'll see you soon in the next video.